Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Daniel thought he knew about his life shattered in real time, because Heather didn't return with screams or accusations or tears. She returned with 3 quiet, devastating truths, and each one landed like a controlled explosion that ultimately tore Daniel and Tessa apart in a way no affair, no lie, no outside enemy ever could, as the story unfolded in slow, unbearable layers that left everyone reeling. Starting with the moment Heather appeared at society during the early evening rush, the door opening just wide enough for her silhouette to be recognized before her face was fully seen, causing Daniel to freeze mid-sentence while talking to Tessa, his coffee going cold in his hand as his mind rejected what his eyes were insisting was real, because Heather Weber had been declared dead, mourned, buried, and locked away in his grief as a closed chapter. And yet there she was, not a ghost, not a hallucination, but flesh and blood. Her voice steady as she said his name with a familiarity that cut deeper than anger ever could, and in that instant Tessa felt it too. The shift, the invisible tectonic movement that happens when a past love walks back into the present with unfinished business. And before anyone could react, Heather asked for 5 minutes alone with Daniel, not as a demand but as a request weighted with history, and something in her eyes told him this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. So he agreed, leading her outside where the autumn air felt too sharp, too real, as if the world itself was daring him to accept what was happening. And that's when Heather delivered the first thing, the first truth, spoken softly but with devastating precision. Daniel, I didn't disappear because I didn't love you. I disappeared because I loved you enough to let you go. That single sentence rewrote everything Daniel had believed about her supposed death, because Heather explained that the threats she'd been receiving years earlier weren't random, that someone connected to a case she was investigating had made it clear that Daniel would be collateral damage, and when she realized the danger wouldn't stop, she made the impossible choice to vanish completely, using resources and help she never thought she'd have to rely on, staging her death so thoroughly that even Daniel would believe it, because if he knew she was alive, he'd come looking, and that would have gotten him killed. And as Daniel struggled to breathe through the revelation, Heather looked him straight in the eye and said the words that changed how he saw his present relationship. I watched you from afar, Daniel. I saw you survive. I saw you fall apart. And when you finally started to love again, I stayed gone for her. The implication hit him instantly. Heather knew about Tessa, had known for a long time, had made a conscious decision not to interfere, not to reclaim her place, and that kind of sacrifice unsettled Daniel more than any betrayal could have, because it forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that Heather had loved him in a way that asked nothing in return. And when Tessa later asked what Heather had said, Daniel couldn't bring himself to fully explain it, already creating the first crack between them. But the damage deepened with the second thing, which Heather revealed later that night when Daniel finally sought her out again, unable to let the past remain half-explained, meeting her at the old park near Chancellor Mansion where so many of his memories with her lived. And this time Heather didn't ease into it. She simply said, "You and Tessa are built on survival, not truth." Daniel bristled at that, defending his relationship, insisting that what he and Tessa had was real, hard-earned, forged through pain. But Heather didn't argue. She didn't judge. She just laid out the facts with the clarity of someone who had spent years observing from a distance, pointing out that Daniel and Tessa had come together when they were both running from grief, from guilt, from expectations from themselves. And while that kind of connection can be powerful, it can also be fragile, because when the crisis fades, what's left has to stand on honesty, not just shared wounds. And then she said the sentence that echoed in Daniel's head long after she walked away. Ask her what she's still hiding from you. Not what she's afraid to tell the world, what she's afraid to tell herself. That night Daniel confronted Tessa, not aggressively, not accusingly, but with a quiet seriousness that immediately put her on edge, because she sensed this wasn't about Heather being alive. It was about something deeper, something exposed. And when Daniel asked if there were parts of her life, her past, or even her present she was still keeping separate from him, Tessa deflected at first, insisting everyone is entitled to privacy, but Daniel pushed gently, explaining that Heather's return had made him realize how dangerous half-truths can be, and that's when Tessa'S composure cracked just enough to reveal fear, real fear, as she admitted that she had been offered a long-term music contract opportunity overseas, something she hadn't told Daniel about because she didn't want to choose between her career and their relationship, and while that alone might not have ended them, the fact that she had made that decision for both of them without telling him confirmed Heather's observation in a way Daniel couldn't ignore, and still, he wanted to fight for them, wanted to believe they could work through it, until Heather delivered the third thing, the final truth, the one she clearly hadn't wanted to say, but knew she had to, when she asked Daniel to meet her one last time before she planned to leave Genoa City again, not to disappear, but to live openly at last, and as they stood facing each other, the weight of everything unsaid heavy between them, Heather took a breath and said, "Daniel, you don't love me anymore, but you haven't finished grieving me." Those words dismantled him completely, because he realized she was right, that some part of him had been trying to build a future while still carrying the emotional remains of a woman he believed had died, and that unresolved grief had shaped every choice he'd made since, including his relationship with Tessa, and Heather went on to explain that until he truly let go of the version of her he had buried, he would never be fully present with anyone else, no matter how much he cared, and she refused to be the ghost haunting his relationships any longer, which is why she was telling him this now, even though it hurt, because she respected him, and Tessa, too much to let a lie linger, and when Daniel returned home after that conversation, he was different, quieter, more grounded, and when he sat across from Tessa and told her they needed to talk, she knew before he said the words that this wasn't a fight, it was an ending. And as Daniel explained that Heather's return had forced him to confront truths he'd been avoiding, that he needed time to grieve properly, to be alone, to figure out who he was without loss defining him, Tessa listened in silence, tears falling but no accusation spoken, because deep down she understood, and she admitted that she too had been using their relationship as a safe harbor instead of facing her own fears about independence and ambition. And their breakup wasn't explosive or dramatic, it was quiet, devastating, and real, the kind of separation that hurts more because no one is truly wrong, and as news spread through Genoa City that Heather was alive, reactions rippled outward. Phyllis furious that she'd been kept in the dark, Lucy overwhelmed with questions, old enemies resurfacing, and new storylines igniting, but at the heart of it all was the undeniable truth that Heather's 3 words, her 3 revelations, didn't just resurrect her. They dismantled the emotional architecture of Daniel's life, forcing him to start again from the ground up, while Heather, finally free from hiding, walked away not as a villain or a savior, but as the woman who loved him enough to tell him the truth, even when it cost her everything, and in true the young and the restless fashion, her return proved that in Genoa City, the past is never truly buried, love never truly dies, and sometimes the most shocking resurrection isn't a person, it's the truth they bring with them. And yet the fallout from Heather's return didn't stop with Daniel and Tessa'S quiet, heartbreaking breakup, because in Genoa City nothing ever ends cleanly, it only spreads, like emotional shockwaves rippling outward until everyone feels them, and as Daniel began the slow, painful work of actually grieving a woman he had buried alive in his mind, Heather's presence, now very much real, forced long-suppressed truths to surface across town, starting with Lucy, who overheard whispers at school before Daniel could find the right words to explain, and when she confronted him with trembling anger, demanding to know how a mother could come back from the dead, Daniel realized just how deep Heather's sacrifice had cut, because Lucy didn't just feel abandoned once, she felt abandoned twice, and Heather, to her credit, didn't make excuses or justify herself. She sat with Lucy for hours, listening to the hurt, the accusations, the tears, and she said something that stunned even Daniel when he overheard it from the hallway. "You're allowed to hate me. I'll still stay." That moment alone reframed Heather in the eyes of many, because she wasn't asking for forgiveness, she was earning it, slowly, painfully, and meanwhile Tessa, reeling from the breakup, tried to throw herself into music, only to find that every lyric she wrote circled back to the same truth, that she had loved Daniel. Yes, but she had also hidden behind him, and Mariah saw it immediately, calling her out late one night with brutal honesty, reminding her that love isn't supposed to be a shelter from yourself. It's supposed to be a place where you show up fully, flaws and all. And as Tessa finally admitted, she had been terrified of choosing herself, even if it meant losing someone she loved. The question became whether the breakup was truly the end, or the beginning of something more honest for both of them. While Daniel, caught between past and present, found himself increasingly isolated, not because people didn't care, but because they didn't know how to respond to a man whose grief had suddenly come back to life. And it was Phyllis who finally cornered Heather, her fury barely contained as she demanded to know how Heather could justify letting everyone believe she was dead. And Heather didn't flinch, didn't deflect. She simply said, "I didn't ask you to understand. I just need you to know it saved his life." That stopped Phyllis cold, because in Genoa City, survival has always been the unspoken currency, and even she couldn't argue with that. Though it didn't stop her from warning Heather that the past always collects its debts, and sure enough, it did, because whispers began to surface about who had helped Heather disappear in the first place, drawing the attention of Victor Newman, who doesn't tolerate loose ends, especially ones that involve staged deaths and false identities. And as Victor began quietly digging, Heather realized that coming back had put her back in danger, not from the original threat alone, but from the powerful players who hate being manipulated. And when she tried to leave town again, Daniel stopped her, not out of love, but out of closure, telling her that running had defined both of them for too long, and that if she was going to live, she had to live openly, consequences and all. A sentiment that surprised even him because it meant he was finally stepping out of the role of the man left behind. And that growth didn't go unnoticed by Tessa, who saw the change in him during a chance encounter at Crimson Lights, where their conversation was awkward but gentle, filled with the kind of honesty they'd never quite mastered before, and for the first time, they spoke not as a couple, but as two people acknowledging what they had been, and what they weren't ready to be. And though there was still affection, there was no denial, no clinging, just acceptance, which hurt in a different way, quieter but deeper, while Heather, determined not to be the catalyst for more destruction, sought out Tessa herself, leading to one of the most unexpected conversations in recent memory, as Heather apologized, not for existing, not for loving Daniel, but for the pain her return caused, acknowledging that Tessa had stepped into a relationship shaped by loss she never created, and Tessa, in turn, admitted that hearing Heather speak made her realize that real love doesn't always fight to stay. It sometimes steps back, and that mutual recognition shifted something profound between them, not friendship, not rivalry, but respect. And as weeks passed, Daniel began therapy, something he'd avoided for years, finally unpacking the guilt of moving on, the anger of being left, and the subconscious fear that loving anyone meant risking annihilation. And in those sessions, he said something that marked a turning point. "I didn't lose Heather once. I lost her every day. I thought she was dead." That realization freed him in ways he hadn't expected, allowing him to stop idealizing the past and start seeing Heather as she was now, a woman changed by survival, not the untouchable memory he'd been in love with. And when Heather eventually decided to stay in Genoa City, not permanently but honestly, she did so knowing she might face legal, emotional, and personal consequences. But for the first time, she wasn't hiding, and that choice alone altered the dynamic between her and Daniel, shifting it from unresolved romance to something quieter, more grounded, a shared history acknowledged but no longer weaponized by silence. And the town reacted as it always does, some with empathy, some with suspicion, some with opportunism. But the undeniable truth was that Heather's return had forced everyone to confront the lies they tell themselves to survive, whether it was Daniel clinging to unfinished grief, Tessa avoiding self-determination, or Genoa City itself pretending that buried secrets stay buried. And as new threats emerged, hinting that the danger Heather ran from might not be fully gone, Daniel found himself protective again, not possessive, not romantic, but resolute, refusing to let fear dictate his life anymore. And when Tessa finally accepted the overseas offer she'd once hidden, Their goodbye was bittersweet but supportive, a full-circle moment that proved growth doesn't always reunite people. Sometimes it simply sets them free, and Heather watched it all with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that the three things she'd said, the truths she'd chosen to speak, had shattered lives in order to rebuild them on firmer ground. And as she stood alone at the edge of Chancellor Park one evening, reflecting on the cost of survival, Daniel joined her, not to confess love, not to reopen wounds, but to thank her, because in the end, Heather hadn't just come back from the dead. She'd given him permission to live, and in a town defined by deception, betrayal, and dramatic returns, that might have been the most shocking twist of all, proving once again that on the young and the restless, resurrection isn't about coming back. It's about finally telling the truth and letting it change everything. And even after all of that, the reverberations of Heather's return continued to reshape Genoa City in subtle, profound ways that no one could have predicted, because on the young and the restless, a single revelation rarely impacts just one person. It radiates, touching every corner of lives tangled together in love, rivalry, and family, and Heather's presence became a catalyst for both reflection and confrontation. Daniel, having faced the raw truth of his grief and the fragility of his relationship with Tessa, began seeing the world differently. He noticed the patterns of avoidance, both in himself and in those around him, the ways people hide from loss, from responsibility, from truths too painful to speak aloud. He realized that the emotional groundwork Heather had laid through her three revelations wasn't just about their breakup. It was about honesty as a foundation for every relationship he would have in the future, and that insight began to shape his interactions with everyone, from colleagues at Jabot to friends and family who had quietly observed his struggles. Meanwhile, Heather herself became a figure of paradoxical power and vulnerability. While she had returned from the dead with clarity and purpose, her reappearance opened old wounds with people who had mourned her, feared her disappearance, or even resented the mystery that had enveloped her absence. Victor, who had long controlled the fates of those around him, found himself facing someone he could not manipulate with threats or money, someone whose choices had been made entirely for love and survival, and that challenged his assumptions about loyalty and control. Phyllis, still simmering over being left out of the truth, discovered herself reassessing her own values, questioning how much of life is spent grasping for power versus understanding, and how often revenge or judgment only prolongs pain rather than resolving it. Even Tessa'S decision to take her overseas music opportunity became emblematic of the way Heather's truths had set everyone free. Tessa'S move was more than career ambition. It was a declaration of self-worth, a recognition that she could no longer define herself by her relationship with Daniel or by fear of loss, and her growth became a mirror for Daniel's own evolution, reflecting that closure and honesty could coexist with love and care, even if the romantic aspect of a relationship ended. Their interactions became less about passion and more about mutual acknowledgement. Two people who had shared intense emotions, now capable of seeing each other as whole, flawed, independent human beings. As the town processed Heather's return, new tensions arose as well. Rumors about the people who had aided her disappearance years ago began to surface, drawing the attention of law enforcement and even some of the darker elements of Genoa City. Heather's return was no longer a private affair. It was a public event that required careful navigation, and her every move was scrutinized by allies and enemies alike. The knowledge that danger was still lurking, combined with the emotional stakes she had reopened, added a layer of urgency and realism to her life in Genoa City, forcing Heather to adapt, to engage, and to trust selectively, all while maintaining the integrity that had made her decision to vanish so morally complex in the first place. Through it all, Daniel's evolution remained central. He began to embrace vulnerability in ways he had avoided for years, seeking support from friends, expressing emotions previously suppressed, and learning that strength isn't always about control or stoicism. It's about confronting pain, acknowledging it, and moving forward with intention. His journey became not just about Heather or Tessa, but about redefining what it meant to live authentically after loss, and his progress served as a quiet reminder to Genoa City that personal growth is often messy, nonlinear, and deeply tied to the courage of facing one's own truths. Finally, Heather's own arc reached a point of tentative equilibrium. Though she could never erase the past or undo the years of absence, she had re-established herself as a force in Genoa City, alive, visible, and honest. Her 3 revelations to Daniel: why she disappeared, what she observed from afar, and the truth about his unresolved grief, had done more than break a couple apart. They had opened a path toward healing for multiple lives intertwined with hers. Heather's return, shocking as it was, became a lesson for all of Genoa City. That truth has power beyond drama, that closure sometimes demands confrontation.